Hi, I'm Thom Ruhe of the Kauffman Foundation. Welcome to Top of Mind, random thoughts and missives from the world of entrepreneurship. This week I hope to recap some stories that caught my attention and hopefully will catch yours. I think most top of mind today that kind of struck me is what's been happening in crowdfunding. It's just been taken off. It's been quite an explosion. Perhaps the best known is Kickstarter. You know, most folks in that space are familiar with some of their really wild successes. You know, it says here one of them, this outfit called Ouya, for instance, and you know, my apologies to the good people of Ouya that if I mispronounced that. But they came on out with a goal to raise $950,000 and walked away with about 8.6 mil. You know, that's a pretty good get to walk away with. You know, I'm kind of proud in this space to be one of the early pioneers. You know, I have this wonderful Kickstarter watch band with my beautiful Apple iPod. TikTok was the company behind this. The team was, they were originally working for Nike in producing watches. And they figured out a very clever way to add that technology to the use of an iPod. And I got to tell you, big fan. I love, you know, the whole crowdfunding movement, so to speak. Now, a little bit of clarity on that. You know, people think because Kickstarter and other such sites have been around for a while that you know, this is all a matter of settled business. In other words, the rules are there, when in fact they're not yet. It's still being figured out. But, you know, when I think about it, why do I like, you know, from my purview sitting here at the Kauffman Foundation, why do we like crowdfunding? Well, you know, frankly, it's because it's a nice alternative to the standard access to capital dilemma that entrepreneurs have been dealing with over, you know, the last several decades. You know, namely, they start, as we say, tongue-in-cheek, with friends, family, and fools. You know, that's your credit card's maxed out. That's doing all those things that cause wonderful stress in your life. And then they had to go typically, you know, begging and pleading to, you know, all the financial sources out there, the angel networks, so to speak, and then venture capital. Well, I got to tell you, keep your eye on crowdfunding because it's really changing the dynamic, the balance of power that's happening in the funding space. And for aspiring, you know, folks out there that are trying to get their company started, look at crowdfunding as a viable opportunity. Again, more clarity will be coming down. Early part of 2013, the SEC will put some parameters around it, but it's going to be a platform to watch. Now, it's not just in the space of funding, you know, new companies and startups. I see here from my little briefing that another nonprofit organization that's playing in the crowdfunding space is WATSI, W-A-T-S-I. And WATSI is a platform that's letting users apparently fund medical treatments for people in developing countries. Now, you know, I'm sure we all have our causes that are near and dear to our heart, but boy, I gotta tell you, that seems like a pretty good use of the internet. It's certainly better than, you know, all these offers I'm getting from Nigerian princes to help me, you know, with my money. And I think, you know, you look at that and you put on top of that things like Kiva that have been in this space doing similar good. If you're not careful, pretty soon we have a good use and a good story for the internet and for crowdfunding. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to introduce you to a friend, this guy. For those of you who don't recognize this colorful lad, this is the Google Fiber Bunny. They're better known as their mascot for Google Fiber. And what is Google Fiber, you ask? Rabbit, you want to tell them or should I? All right, I'll tell them. Google Fiber is an exciting pipe, if you will. It's an internet connectivity, a project that Google has chosen Kansas City to debut with. And it is a 1 gigabit connection to your home. Now think of that. A gigabit connection is about 100 times faster than the best connection you can get commercially from any of the, you know, the today's providers, you know, the big providers that are out there in the market. And, when you think about that, 100 times faster, how does that affect me, personally? Well, Netflix, Hulu, your poison of choice, Apple TV, anything that you stream from, think of 4 or 5 gig movie that you can watch the load bar go like this, adequate in most cases. But now think of that going like this. Done. All loaded. Real time. High res. Things that wouldn't even normally be practical because of size limitations are now possible. What was never even practical is now possible. That's big. And it's big because it can impact us on multiple levels, on a societal level. Think about, I don't know, like neighborhood watch, opportunities. I've heard of, certain fiber rings around the country that have, faster speeds, certainly not their 1 gigabit speed, but fast enough, where they've installed cameras around the neighborhoods, and citizens can dial in on IP addresses and watch specific cameras and look out for one another. Telemedicine is a great application where you can take a technician and send them into the home of somebody that's shut in, and give them access to medical care and attention that they might not otherwise, because in real time with a big fat pipe for data, you can ship that that information from a scan or whatnot, and have somebody looking at it, a qualified doctor that could be anywhere in the world, not even somebody that's local. That's what that empowers you to do, and that's to say nothing of the entrepreneurial opportunities that it can provide. Think about companies that, are doing data modeling or graphic resolution or gaming, that where speed matters, right? That puts this region, Kansas City, in play competitively to draw and attract talent that might not otherwise be available. So needless to say, first of all, thank you, Bunny. We're all very excited about this here in Kansas City. It's a great thing for the region. Google chose to, kind of come out with a bifurcated deployment. So it's going to be on the Kansas City, Kansas side that gets it first. We found out just today, Hanover Heights. Congratulations, Hanover. You're the lucky ones. You're going to be the first. Over on the KCMO side, we're going to be coming a little bit later. We're hearing that it looks like Crown Center, Kansas City, Missouri, will be the first on the KCMO side that'll be able to take advantage of that. So way to go, Google Fiber. A lot of excited people in the region that are thinking great ways to take advantage of this this just wonderful 1 gigabit connection. So stay tuned. There'll be definitely more coming on that topic. So that got me thinking, how might this start disintermediating, or how might this start, impacting the world of entrepreneurship? And, at the Kauffman Foundation, we have the good fortune of hearing all manner of stories from all sources. People that are doing interesting things and really challenging what it means to even be an entrepreneur, right? Is the guy that's got the gas station down at the corner, is he an entrepreneur? Is it the woman that's, running the dry cleaning business an entrepreneur? Is it the next aspiring, Zuckerberg or Jobs entrepreneur? I don't even have religion on that anymore. I think for too many people, that title, has so many emotional connotations to it. I like to say that entrepreneurship is one of those words that has a lot of positive brand confusion, right? You can ask 10 people to define what an entrepreneur is. You're going to get 11 answers, but they'll all be generally pretty positive. So if we take that as a given, I always like to reflect on some stories, and there was one that crossed my attention here, and it's about an entrepreneur in New York City who really represents an almost a bygone era. He makes by hand suits. Now, these aren't any suits. You're not buying these off the rack somewhere, okay? These are handmade. I mean, measured to the T to fit you. And, they're priced accordingly, as you might expect from an intensity standpoint of workload. They're about $4,000 a throw. And I have to believe if you run a business that's doing handmade suits, that takes you almost a month to do 2 suits. Even at $4,000 a throw, do the math on that. This guy is not getting rich off of this business. When he was interviewed for the story, one of the things he said that's very intense about the process is sizing. Just figuring out if it's a custom-made suit. A perfect example of a nice lumpy person. There's going to be a lot of time and effort put into that. Is there a way that technology can affect that in some way? And sure enough, let the entrepreneurial community come to the rescue. There's another entrepreneur who's looking to impact what's happening in kind of the fashion industry, and fit being a big, big issue. For those of you out there that have, wives and girlfriends, I'm sure they would vouch for that fact. And they've come up with a company called Fit-A-Kit. I think I'm getting that right. Which really, it takes the technology out there of laser scanning and, off-the-shelf imaging technology, and provides it to, a centuries-old industry of fashion, where you can go into any Fit-A-Kit, facility. They're right now out of San Francisco, but it'll ostensibly provide and create a 3D model of your body, a mannequin, if you will, that can then be shared. You have that data, and as long as you don't, get heavier or skinnier or change all that much, you'll have now kind of your 3D dimensions, if you will, that you can share with companies that are out there now that are evolving to do custom, on-demand, manufacturing of clothing. And I just love hearing stories when kind of new technology takes advantage of, old technology to make a better product at the end of it. And I just think that's great. And it reaffirms, my just love and passion for the entrepreneurial spirit that exists here. So speaking of the spirit of entrepreneurship, in this great country of ours, we recently released a new study that we did in partnership with Inc. magazine and the good people over there that do the Inc. 500 conference and track Inc. 500 companies. Some interesting data came out of this. Let's see here. It says, basically after examining 30 years worth of the Inc. 500 firm data, what we're starting to see is perhaps a city strategy, cities cluster reality that's coming out. There seems to be trends that one can extrapolate after 30 years of data. And, I don't know, maybe some of this is interesting to you or surprising to you. It was to me. If I'm being honest, I'm still struggling to interpret what it means and how to interpret it. And here's what I mean by this. So if you were to look at what the top cities were, I'm sure a lot of people would think like large commercial hubs, retail hubs, Chicago and LA and places like that. But you'd be wrong. I mean, in some cases, you'd be wrong at least. The #1 city that created the most Inc. 500 companies is Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And that got me really scratching my head. I mean, I know that is the cradle of our government. I also happen to know that the United States government is the single largest consumer of goods and services of any entity in the entire world, bar none. Another fun fact, even though the U.S. government is the single largest consumer of goods and services, fewer than 2% of U.S. companies actually even sell goods or services to our government. Now that's probably a topic better left for another day as to why such a smaller percentage of our own companies sell to our own government. In the 90s, I had experience to work with a lot of defense contractors, and I get it, why it's such a low percentage. It's not easy. I like to tell friends that, you heard this story a long time ago about, $900 toilet seats, and $500 hammers. And like most people would, I was always frustrated like that. How in the heck could they be spending, $900 until I started getting into defense work? And then I understood how that comes about, because there's layer upon layer upon layer that gets in there. And as I said, that's a topic for another time to discuss. Suffice to say that nearly half, according to the data, nearly half of those those Inc. 500 companies in Washington, D.C., do pull their business from the federal government. So that said, if you took that part out of the equation, it's still a pretty impressive number. Provo, Utah, it says, is in the top 10 cities that educated the most founders, retained the most founders, and retained the highest percentage of founders. So I don't know what's in the water in Provo, but apparently they're Provo proud, and they like to stick around. Which, if you've been in other entrepreneurial significant cities like, Seattle, for the Microsoft effect, if you will, and certainly Google, in Mountain View, there's no doubt that the communities that foster a vibrant, dynamic entrepreneurial culture do very, very well. And it's evident in the cascading benefits that come out of it, not just in the growing tax base that happens locally with people generating and creating wealth there, but the spillover effect too, right? I remember the first startup that I ever got involved in. It's all so new, and you're so uncertain in finding your way. But after a while, you get into your stride, and then you find your place in this order. And pretty soon, you look at the founder and you say, "You're not that much smarter than I am. This is not that much harder than I can do." And at some point, at least for some percentage of people, they take that leap, right? They jump out. And that cascading effect is very, very good for communities. It's what starts the job engine. It's what catalyzes job growth. It's also why, frankly, we exist at the Kauffman Foundation. It was the vision of our namesake, Mr. Kauffman. It was the risk he took in founding Marion Labs that grew into something very, very large in Kansas City. There were thousands of people that made their living, that made their house payment and their car payment and sent their kids to college because this entrepreneur took this chance and started this company. And you know what else happened? When he sold that company, over 300 of his earliest employees became millionaires. That's the true impact. And even beyond that, some percentage of them, over 50 of them, took that wealth and they started the next generation of companies. That's why we have the privilege to do what we do here at the Foundation. And that's what we're hoping to be able to share with you with some frequency on these podcasts. In the coming weeks and months, I'll try to come up with ideas and stories that we hear that might be of interest to you at large. We'd love to hear from you. This is not something that's a one-way dialogue. We'll encourage comments and feedback. We'll let you know what's happening with the bunny from time to time. Again, I think there's going to be some exciting things that come out of this, startup-wise, entrepreneurially speaking. I can tell you this, I've been all over the world for the Foundation, and one of the things I get asked a lot about is this guy. So that's very exciting, and I look forward to having more to talk to you about on that. So thanks for tuning in for now, and look forward to seeing you real soon.